The morning I decided to disappear, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, the kind that floods streets and knocks over trees. It was the quiet kind. The kind that fogs up your kitchen window while you're standing there with a cup of coffee that's gone cold. Staring at nothing in particular, realizing that nobody has called you in 11 days. 11 days! I counted them. I had a little notepad on the counter where I wrote down the date every time one of my sons called. Not texted, called. There's a difference, you know. A text is something you send when you feel obligated. A call is something you make when you actually want to hear someone's voice. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio, the same house where I raised 2 boys, buried a husband, and spent 41 years of my life building something I thought was called a family. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, or at least, at the beginning of the end. My husband, Richard, passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye properly. One day he was complaining about back pain, and 6 months later, I was standing at his graveside in the November cold, holding a single white rose, because he always said yellow roses looked like they were trying too hard. After Richard died, I expected my sons to step closer. That's what families do, isn't it? Tragedy pulls people together. Loss reminds you what matters. That's what I believed. What actually happened was the opposite. My eldest son Daniel was 42 at the time of his father's death. He lived 40 minutes away in a suburb of Columbus with his wife, Renee, and their 2 teenage daughters. Daniel is, how do I describe him kindly, a man who has mistaken busyness for importance. He was always swamped at work, always dealing with something, always just about to call me back. He had Richard's strong jaw and his grandfather's blue eyes, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost whatever warmth Richard had in his chest. My younger son Kevin was 38. He lived closer, just 20 minutes away, but somehow that proximity meant nothing. He'd married a woman named Sandra 2 years before Richard died, and Sandra had very specific opinions about how Kevin spent his time. Kevin, to his credit, was warmer than Daniel. He'd text me memes sometimes. Funny little videos of cats doing ridiculous things. But when I needed him, actually needed him, he had a remarkable talent for being unavailable. And then there was Diane. Diane was Daniel's wife. They'd been married for 15 years. She was 40 years old, sharp-featured, precise in the way she spoke, and had never, in 15 years, made me feel particularly welcome in her home. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't the kind of daughter-in-law who made cutting remarks or rolled her eyes dramatically. She was something harder to fight. She was indifferent. Politely, perfectly, consistently indifferent. She remembered my birthday exactly once in 15 years. She always had a reason why the grandchildren couldn't visit. She answered my calls with the practiced efficiency of someone handling a work obligation. I had made peace with the fact that Diane didn't love me. I told myself it was fine. Some people just aren't warm. Some relationships are civil and nothing more, and civil is enough. But I want you to understand something. I was not a difficult mother-in-law. I was not the kind of woman who showed up unannounced, who criticized her cooking, who inserted herself into their marriage. I had watched other women do those things, and I had deliberately, consciously, chosen a different path. I gave them space. I waited to be invited. I never said a critical word about how she raised my granddaughters. And still, I was treated like furniture. After Richard died, there was a brief period, maybe 2 months, where both boys called regularly. There were Sunday dinners. Daniel and Renee brought casseroles. Kevin fixed the broken gutter on my porch. It felt like family. Then, gradually, like the slow turning of a season you don't notice until you're suddenly cold, everything faded back to normal. Normal meant I was alone. I want to be clear about something before I go on. I was not poor. I was not helpless. I was not, as my sons sometimes seemed to imagine, some fragile old woman who needed to be managed at a distance. Richard had been a careful man with money. We owned the house outright. He had life insurance. I had my own small retirement account from the 20 years I spent working as an office manager at a local law firm. I'd gone back to work when Kevin started high school, and I'd been good at my job, quietly competent in the way that women my generation often were, doing the work that kept things running while being careful not to seem like we were doing too much. When Richard died, I inherited everything: the house, the savings, the investments he'd made carefully over 40 years of working as an electrical engineer. I was, by any reasonable measure, comfortable. Not wealthy in the way people imagine when they hear that word, but secure, independent, capable. My sons didn't know exactly how much money I had. Richard and I had always been private about finances. We came from a generation that considered money talk unseemly, so they knew I wasn't struggling, but they didn't know the specifics. This would become important later. But in those 11 days of silence, 11 days of a notepad with no new entries, I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about something much simpler and much more devastating. I was thinking, if I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for anyone to notice? I ran the math in my head. Daniel called maybe once every 2 weeks, sometimes 3. Kevin texted more but called less. My neighbor Phyllis was a sweet woman, but she worked long hours and we weren't close enough for daily check-ins. My friend from church, Loretta, was dealing with her own health problems. I thought, it might be a week, it might be more. That thought didn't make me cry. I was past the age of crying easily. It made me something quieter and more dangerous. It made me determined. I had spent 67 years being the kind of woman who absorbed disappointment gracefully, who didn't make a fuss, who found a way to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection were offered. My mother had taught me that. Her mother had taught her that. It was the inheritance of our generation, the quiet endurance, the dignified suffering, the belief that asking for too much made you a burden. I was done with that. I put down my cold coffee. I looked out at the foggy window. And I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out, once and for all, who really loved me, not who loved the idea of me, the capable, self-sufficient Margaret, who never needed anything, not who loved me when it was easy and convenient. I wanted to know who would show up when I was nothing, when I had nothing, when I needed everything. I was going to pretend to be sick and poor and utterly alone, and I was going to watch what happened. I spent 3 days planning it carefully. I've always been methodical. 40 years of running a household and 20 years of office management will do that to you. I made lists. I thought through every detail. The plan was simple in structure, but complex in execution. I would call each of my sons and tell them I hadn't been feeling well. I would be vague at first, just tired, not quite myself. Then I would escalate. I would mention that I'd had to skip some meals because I hadn't had the energy to cook. I would let small worrying details drop into conversation. The way you do when you're not quite asking for help, but leaving the door open. I would also, carefully, let it slip that I was having some financial trouble. Not dramatic trouble. I wasn't going to claim I was about to lose the house, but I would mention that the furnace had broken and the repair estimate was more than I expected, and that I was trying to figure out how to manage it. I would say it casually, the way you mention something you're dealing with, not begging, just sharing. And then I would wait. I would wait to see who called, who visited, who showed up. I called Daniel first. It was a Thursday evening. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Mom." He sounded distracted. I could hear the television in the background, the particular murmur of a sports broadcast. "Hi, sweetheart." I kept my voice slightly flat. Not dramatically different, just less bright than usual. "How are you?" We talked for a few minutes about nothing, his work, the girls. I let the pauses run a little longer than usual. Then, carefully, "I've been having a rough week, just feeling really run down. I don't know, maybe I'm fighting something off." "Oh, that's no fun," he said. Automatic, reflexive, the words you say when you're not really listening. Make sure you rest. I'm trying. A pause. The thing is, it's hard to sleep when you're stressed. The furnace has been making a strange noise and I called someone to look at it, and the estimate was, well, it was more than I expected. How much? I gave him a number. Not outrageous, but enough to feel like a burden on a fixed income. There was a beat of silence. That is a lot. Have you tried getting a second opinion? I might do that, I said. I'm tired, you know. It's hard to manage all of this alone. Yeah, I hear you, Daniel said. And then, with the practiced smoothness of a man who has been redirecting uncomfortable conversations his whole adult life. Hey, I should let you go. Renee's calling me for dinner. But feel better, okay? Keep me posted. I will, I said. Good night, sweetheart. I put the phone down and wrote in my notepad. Daniel, Thursday did not offer to come. Did not offer to help with furnace. Duration, 6 minutes. I called Kevin the next day. The conversation followed a remarkably similar arc. He was warmer. He said, "That sucks, Mom. I'm sorry," in a way that sounded almost genuine, but when I mentioned the furnace and the tiredness, he said he'd been really slammed at work and things were crazy right now, but he'd try to check in soon. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He didn't offer to come over. He said he'd try to check in soon. Kevin, Friday. Did not offer to come. Did not offer to help. Duration, 8 minutes. I sat with my notepad for a long moment after that second call. I wasn't surprised. That was the saddest part. I wasn't surprised at all. But what happened next? What happened on that rainy Tuesday night 2 weeks later? That surprised me. That surprised me so completely that it rearranged everything I thought I knew about people, about family, about the ones we write off before giving them a chance. The weeks that followed my decision were, in a strange way, the loneliest and most clarifying weeks of my life. I had a plan, but plans take time. And while I was executing mine slowly, carefully, the way you tend a garden, I was also living inside a reality that the plan was designed to reveal. The loneliness wasn't performance. The tiredness was real, even if the illness wasn't. 67 years old, living alone in a house that had once been full of noise and life, staging a quiet crisis to see who would notice. It was its own kind of grief. I escalated the story gradually. That was important. If I changed too suddenly, it would seem theatrical. I needed it to feel real, because the emotions underneath it were real. The vulnerability I was performing was just the visible version of the vulnerability I'd been carrying privately for years. The second time I called Daniel, I mentioned that I'd had a dizzy spell getting out of bed. Just a small thing, I said. Probably nothing, but I'd had to hold on to the nightstand for a moment before I felt steady. Have you called your doctor? He asked. I have an appointment next week, I said. It's probably just my blood pressure. You know how it fluctuates. Right, he said. And then, a pause. Well, let me know what they say. Not, do you want me to come with you? Not, should I call and check on you after? Just, let me know what they say. I let the silence hold for just a moment before I said, of course. I'll keep you posted. I called my doctor's office, a real call. Not part of the performance. And I told the nurse that I'd been feeling more tired than usual, and asked if there was anything I should watch for. She was kind. She said to monitor my blood pressure and come in if I felt significantly worse. I thanked her and hung up, feeling oddly comforted by the fact that someone, even a nurse who'd never met me, had responded with basic human care. The furnace story developed legs. I mentioned it a second time to Kevin, more specifically. I said I'd gotten a second estimate. And it was actually worse. Now the technician was saying the whole unit might need to be replaced, not just repaired. Oh geez, Kevin said, that's rough. It's a lot to handle alone, I said. My voice didn't wobble. I kept it steady but tired. I've been trying to figure out if I can pull from my savings or if I should look into some kind of financing. I heard Kevin shift on the phone. The sound of a man trying to figure out how to exit a conversation without seeming like he was exiting it. "Have you talked to Daniel about it?" he said. There it was. "Have you talked to Daniel about it?" In our family, that phrase, or variations of it, was the verbal equivalent of a hot potato. One brother would suggest the other. The other would be unavailable. The responsibility would float in the air between them, never landing, until I eventually handled things myself, which I always did. Which they had learned, through years of my quiet competence, that I always would. I mentioned it to him. I said, he suggested getting a second opinion, right? Yeah. Kevin sounded relieved that he and his brother were aligned in their unhelpfulness. That's probably smart. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, my cold coffee, my notepad, the foggy window. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman who ran this household, who managed every crisis, who made everything work through sheer force of organized, quiet determination. Richard used to call me the most capable person he'd ever met. He said it with such genuine admiration that it always made me cry a little, because I knew he meant it. And because I knew that the flip side of being the most capable person in the room is that everyone lets you be. My sons had learned early that Mom would handle it. Mom always handled it. There was never any urgency, because Mom was there. And when Richard died, nothing changed, except that now I was handling everything completely alone. And still nobody felt any urgency, because I was still Mom, and Mom always handled it. The performance was revealing a truth that I had suspected but hadn't wanted to name. My sons didn't think of me as a person who needed things. They thought of me as a resource. Stable, reliable, infinitely available, there when they wanted me, negligible when they didn't. I was staging an illness and a financial crisis, but the loneliness was not staged. The exhaustion was not staged. The deep, bone-level sadness of being a woman who had given everything she had to a family and was now in her late 60s, sitting alone in a kitchen, wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared, that was as real as anything I had ever felt. I let myself sit with it. I didn't run from it. I was too old and too tired to run from feelings anymore. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I called Diane. Not Daniel. Diane, directly. I want to be honest about my motivation here, because it wasn't pure. There was something in me, some small, slightly vindictive part that I'm not proud of but won't pretend doesn't exist, that wanted to call Diane specifically because I expected her to be cold. I expected her to give me the polished, professional non-response she always gave me, and I wanted that data point. I wanted to be able to say, to myself, if no one else, that I had tried with everyone, and everyone had failed me, and I therefore had the full picture. I didn't expect what happened instead. I called on a Wednesday afternoon. Diane answered quickly, second ring. Margaret. She sounded slightly surprised. I almost never called her directly. The chain of communication in our family ran through the sons, the way all family communication runs through whatever poor soul has been silently appointed the conduit. Hi, Diane, I said. I'm sorry to bother you. I was actually trying to reach Daniel, but he wasn't answering, and I've been having a rough few days and I suppose I just wanted to talk to someone. A pause, shorter than I expected. What's going on? She said, and her voice was different. Not warmer. Exactly, Diane wasn't a warm person, at least not in the easy, immediate way, but she was present, focused. The way a person gets when they realize they're actually being called upon. I told her what I'd told the boys. The dizziness, the furnace, the tiredness, the feeling of struggling to manage everything alone. She listened without interrupting. That was the first thing that struck me. She actually listened. She didn't fill the silences with reflexive reassurances. She didn't rush to redirect. She just listened. When I finished, she said, "How long has this been going on?" "A few weeks," I said. "It comes and goes." "And you've seen your doctor?" "I have an appointment scheduled." Another pause. I waited for the exit, the polite acknowledgement, the vague promise to have Daniel call me. Instead, Diane said, "Can I ask you something direct, Margaret?" "Of course." "Are you eating properly?" I know that sounds like a strange question, but when my mother was going through something similar a few years ago, the first thing that went was her appetite. She didn't notice how depleted she was getting, because everything else felt like a bigger problem. I was so surprised that for a moment I didn't answer. Diane was asking about my eating. Diane, who had given me politely indifferent birthday cards for 15 years, was on the phone asking me if I was eating properly, in the careful voice of a woman who had learned something the hard way. "I've been managing," I said, which was true enough. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to talk to Daniel. And Margaret, if you need anything before that appointment, please call me, I mean that." I hung up and sat there for a full minute, staring at nothing. I wrote in my notepad, "Diane. Wednesday asked follow-up questions, listened, offered to follow up. Duration, 14 minutes, 14 minutes. More than Daniel and Kevin combined in their last calls." I told myself it didn't mean anything. People surprise you sometimes. It was a single phone call. It didn't prove anything. But it planted something. A small, uncomfortable seed of a thought that I didn't know what to do with yet. The days continued. I kept up the gentle escalation. I mentioned to Daniel, when he finally called back 2 days later, that I'd almost fallen in the bathroom. I was careful. I said I'd grabbed the towel bar in time, that I was fine, but that it had shaken me. The kinds of details that make the inside of a person's chest tighten, if they love you. Daniel said, "Maybe you should get one of those grip bars installed." He did not say he would come install one. He did not say, "Mom, I'm coming over." He said maybe you should get one of those grip bars installed. Which was, in its own way, a complete and total portrait of who my eldest son had become. I kept a straight face during the call, metaphorically speaking, since he couldn't see me, and thanked him for the suggestion. But after I hung up, something shifted in my chest. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, something harder and clearer than either of those things. I thought about all the grip bars I had installed by myself over the course of my life, metaphorically and literally. I thought about every crisis I had handled, every problem I had absorbed, every time I had quietly solved something so that my sons could continue moving through the world unencumbered. I thought about the years I had spent making myself small and capable and undemanding so that nobody would ever feel like I was a burden. And I thought, what a waste. What a magnificent, exhausting, lonely waste. The plan was already in motion. But in that moment, sitting in my kitchen with my notepad and my cold coffee and the Ohio November pressing gray against my windows, it became something more than a test. It became a reckoning. The rain came back on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after I'd started the plan. I had escalated things carefully. A week before, I'd told both Daniel and Kevin that I'd spoken to my doctor, and that she wanted to run some additional tests. I was vague about what kind. I said she was just being cautious, checking a few things. I kept my voice calm and slightly tired. The voice of a woman trying to be brave about something she was privately worried about. Kevin texted me a heart emoji and said he was thinking of me. Daniel said he hoped the tests came back clear and that I should keep him posted. Neither of them offered to come. I had also, in a separate conversation with Daniel, mentioned that I'd gone ahead and gotten a second estimate on the furnace, and that it confirmed the unit needed replacement. I said I was trying to figure out financing, that it was stressful to face that kind of expense on a fixed income, that I didn't want to ask anyone for help, but I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. Daniel said he would look into some options and get back to me. He didn't get back to me. So there I was, on a Tuesday night, rain tapping against the windows, sitting in my living room with a lamp on and a book I wasn't reading. I had made myself soup for dinner, actually made it, not pretend, because I find cooking meditative, and because I refuse to stop caring for myself, simply because others won't. At 7:43 in the evening, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. I want you to understand that. I had not called anyone that day. I had not manufactured any reason for someone to come. This was not part of the plan. I got up, tightened my cardigan, and went to the door. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. It was Diane. She was standing on my porch in a rain jacket, holding a grocery bag in one arm and what looked like a paper bag from a pharmacy in the other. Her hair was damp at the temples. She was looking steadily at the door, not fidgeting, not checking her phone, just waiting. I stood there for a second longer than I should have. Just standing there, looking through the peephole at the woman I had written off a decade ago. The woman I had categorized as cold and indifferent, standing on my porch in the rain with groceries. I opened the door. "Diane," I said. My voice came out strange, slightly unsteady, which I hadn't expected. "Hi, Margaret." She looked at me directly. Not with pity, I want to be clear about that. Diane's face was not a face that did pity easily. It was something more level than that. Assessment? Maybe. Care expressed through attention rather than softness. "I hope it's okay that I came without calling. Daniel mentioned you'd had a rough week and I was in the area, and I thought I'd come." She held up the bags. "I brought some things. Soup ingredients, mostly. And I picked up a few things from the pharmacy. Nothing dramatic, just some vitamins and a blood pressure monitor, the kind you can use at home. My mother's doctor recommended one." I stared at her. I had been doing this for 3 weeks, carefully, methodically building a portrait of who showed up and who didn't, and I had not seen this coming. Not from her. Of all the people, of all the possibilities, I had not looked through that peephole expecting to find Diane. "Come in," I said. "Please." She came in. She didn't make a production of it. She set the bags on the kitchen counter with the efficiency of a woman who is comfortable making herself useful. And she looked around my kitchen in that direct way she had, taking in the single bowl in the drying rack. The notepad on the counter, I moved quickly to cover it. The general quiet of a house where only one person lived. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I had soup earlier," I said. "I made it myself." "Good." She started unpacking. Chicken broth, fresh vegetables, crackers, a box of herbal tea. "I wasn't sure what you had in. I brought ingredients rather than prepared food, easier to customize." "You didn't have to do this," I said. She paused briefly in her unpacking and looked at me. "I know," she said simply. We were quiet for a moment. "How are you actually feeling?" she asked. She said actually, with a slight emphasis, not aggressive, just honest. The word landed between us like a small, careful offering. Something in my chest moved. Here is what I want to tell you about that moment. About what it felt like to have Diane standing in my kitchen asking me how I was actually feeling. It was the question I had been waiting for someone to ask me for 4 years. Not since Richard died. Not since the boys had let the casseroles and Sunday dinners fade back into absence. Nobody had stood in my kitchen and looked at me like a person who might have an interior life that deserved attention. I almost told her the truth then. The whole truth, the plan, the test, the notepad, all of it. I almost said, "Diane, I'm not actually sick. I'm conducting an experiment to find out whether anyone loves me. And you're the only one who's shown up. And I don't know what to do with that." I didn't, not yet. I wasn't ready. But something shifted in me that night. Something fundamental and quiet, like the ground settling after a long rain. "I'm managing," I said. And then, honestly, it's been lonely. That's the truth of it, if I'm being honest. The health things are worrying but manageable. The loneliness is harder. Diane nodded. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't offer platitudes about how I should reach out more, or how the boys were just busy. She just nodded. "I know," she said again. And then she did something unexpected. She sat down at my kitchen table, not hovering, not preparing to leave. She sat down, like someone who intended to stay, and she looked at me and said, "Can I be honest with you about something, Margaret?" "Please," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. What Diane told me that night, sitting at my kitchen table, while the rain came down outside and the soup ingredients waited patiently on the counter, was something that rewrote, in some important ways, the story I had been telling myself for 15 years. She told me about her own mother. Her mother, whose name was Patricia, had died 2 years ago. Vascular dementia, a slow and brutal decline that had taken 4 years from first symptoms to death. Diane had been, for those 4 years, her mother's primary caregiver, coordinating doctors, managing medications, handling finances, navigating the insurance system, and doing all of it while also working full-time as a project manager and being a wife and mother. She had done almost all of it alone. My siblings weren't able to help much, she said, in the careful way of someone who has chosen their words with deliberate restraint. My brother was in Phoenix. My sister had her own health issues. So it was mostly me. She had watched her mother decline. She had sat with her in hospital rooms. She had, at the end, made the call to move her into memory care, which was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. I'm telling you this, Diane said, because I recognize something in what you're going through, or I think I do. The particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to manage everything while feeling completely unsupported. I know that feeling. And I know how easy it is for the people around you to let you keep managing because you've always managed, and they've learned to trust that you will. I looked at her. That's exactly what it is, I said quietly. I know Daniel doesn't always. She paused, chose her words again. He doesn't always read situations the way he should. He grew up watching you handle everything, and he absorbed the lesson that you handle everything. I've tried to talk to him about it. It's slow going. There was something in her voice when she said that last part, a tiredness, a familiar frustration that made me realize something I hadn't understood before. Diane had not been indifferent to me. She had been managing her own complicated relationship with my son, her own exhaustion, her own private battles. And I had read her reserve as coldness, because I didn't know enough about her to read it correctly. I had failed her too, in my own way. Why did you really come tonight? I asked. She met my eyes. Because Daniel mentioned you'd had a rough week, and something about the way he said it, like it was just an item of information rather than something that concerned him, made me not able to let it go. I've been that person who let things go. With my mother, there were moments where I should have shown up sooner, and I didn't. I'm not willing to make that mistake again. The rain was steady outside. My kitchen was warm. My soup ingredients were on the counter. I said, "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Diane said, "I was hoping you'd ask." We cooked together. She made the soup. I sat at the table and directed her to the spices, which she had to hunt for in my somewhat disorganized cabinet. And we laughed once when she opened a canister, expecting cumin, and found what turned out to be a collection of expired packets of restaurant soy sauce that Richard had saved in the inexplicable way he saved small useless things. Richard saved soy sauce, she said. Richard saved everything, I said. He grew up poor. He never fully trusted that there would be enough. Diane looked at the packets for a moment, then set them down gently on the counter. And the care with which she put them back, not dismissing them, not throwing them away without asking, said something about her that no conversation could have. We ate dinner, we talked, not about illness or furnaces, or the complicated math of family obligation. We talked about her mother and my husband. We talked about what it meant to lose someone slowly versus suddenly. We talked about the strange grief of watching a person become less themselves. I hadn't talked like that in 4 years. When Diane left at 10 o'clock, she stood at the door and said, "I'm going to come again on Thursday, if that's okay, to check on you." "It's okay," I said. She nodded. "And Margaret, call me directly if you need anything before then." Not through Daniel. Me. I watched her walk to her car through the rain. I stood in the doorway until her headlights turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. In my notepad, I wrote, Diane. Tuesday. Showed up without being asked. Stayed 3 hours. Cooked dinner. Talked. Asked how I was actually feeling. I stared at what I'd written, and for the first time since I'd started this plan, I wondered if I'd had the wrong person in mind when I set out to discover who loved me. Diane came on Thursday, as promised. And the Thursday after that. And the one after that. She didn't make it into a production. She didn't arrive with fanfare or announce that she was now Margaret's official caretaker. She just came, sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing but herself. She'd sit at my kitchen table and drink tea while I talked, or we'd watch something on television. Or she'd help me with the small accumulating tasks of the house that had been quietly piling up. A light bulb that needed replacing, a drawer that had swollen shut in the humidity, a pile of paperwork from the insurance company that I'd been avoiding because bureaucracy in all its forms is its own special form of grief. She never made me feel like a project. That was the thing I kept noticing. Some people help you in the way that makes you feel like their charity case. The help comes with an invisible price tag, a slight inflation of their own virtue, a subtle recalibration of the relationship that puts them above you. Diane wasn't like that. She helped the way competent people help, practically, directly, without ceremony. I kept the plan going for a few more weeks, partly because I was still gathering information, and partly, I'll admit, because I didn't know how to stop. I had built something with Diane that was real and new and fragile, and I was afraid that if I told her the truth, it would collapse. During those weeks, I also started paying closer attention to the broader patterns of my family life. Not just the boys' calls, but everything. The birthdays, the holidays, the small signals of how much space I actually occupied in their lives. Thanksgiving was coming. Richard and I had always hosted Thanksgiving, our house, my cooking, the whole extended warmth of a holiday that I'd been building, year after year, into something that felt genuinely important. After Richard died, the boys had come for a year, then less reliably, then not at all. Last year, I'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner alone. I had cooked a small chicken because cooking a turkey for one person felt cruel. And I had sat at the table and thought of all the years the table had been full, and then I'd had a glass of wine and watched old home movies until I felt something other than sad. This year, I called Daniel in the first week of November and asked about plans. "Oh, Renee's family is doing a thing in Columbus," he said. "We usually do Thanksgiving with them now. Didn't we talk about this?" We had not talked about this. "What about Kevin?" I asked. "I think Sandra's family, same as last year." A pause. "You should come with us to Columbus if you want. I'm sure Renee's mom wouldn't mind." I should come to Columbus to spend Thanksgiving with my daughter-in-law's mother, who would probably not mind, as a guest in a stranger's house rather than my own. As an afterthought attached to a son who hadn't thought to mention this plan until I called to ask. "I think I'll be fine here," I said. "Thank you though." "Okay," Daniel said, with the slight relief of a man who had expected to have to argue and didn't. I hung up. I called Diane. I hadn't told her yet, but I needed to tell someone, and she had become, in a way I hadn't anticipated, the person I called when I needed to process something. "He said I should come to Columbus," I told her. "To Renee's mother's house." As if that's the same as having somewhere to go. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come here." "What?" "Come here for Thanksgiving. To our house. I'm cooking this year. Daniel's family. And you." Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was confirming a meeting time. "I'll let Daniel know." "Diane, you don't have to." "I know I don't," she said. "Come at 2. I'll need help with the pie crust, if you're willing. I've never made a good pie crust in my life." I laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere deeper than the chest. "I make an excellent pie crust," I said. "Then it's settled." Thanksgiving at Daniel and Diane's it was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. Daniel was distracted and a little awkward with me. The way sons get when they sense, on some inarticulate level, that they've done something wrong without being sure what it was. My granddaughters were teenagers doing teenager things, phones and eye rolls, and the particular social performance of people who are in the process of becoming themselves and find everyone else slightly exhausting. But Diane and I made pie crust together in her kitchen. We argued gently about whether to add vinegar to the dough. I said yes. She was skeptical. The pie was excellent. We cooked side by side for 3 hours, and there was something in that shared labor, that particular intimacy of kitchen work, of handing someone the salt before they ask for it, of knowing without discussing it who is doing what, that felt more like family than anything I had experienced in years. At dinner, when Daniel said grace, he'd taken it up after Richard died, a small secular version that was more a list of things he was grateful for than a prayer. He mentioned me. He said he was glad Mom was there this year. It was brief and slightly rote, the way grace tends to be, but he said it. I looked at Diane across the table while he said it. She caught my eye and, very slightly, smiled. That night, after the girls had gone upstairs and Daniel had fallen asleep in front of the television, Diane and I washed the dishes together and she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She kept her eyes on the dish she was drying. "The furnace thing, did it really need to be replaced?" Because Daniel mentioned it again last week and said it seemed like it had resolved itself. And I know Daniel, and I know when he's convinced himself something that was inconvenient simply went away. I was very still for a moment. "It resolved itself," I said carefully. She nodded, kept drying. "Then, and the dizziness." I put down the pot I was washing. "Diane," I said. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I'm not asking to be accusatory. She finally looked at me. "I spent a lot of time with my mother before she died. I learned to read the difference between someone who is actually struggling with something physical and someone who is struggling with something else. And I thought, from the beginning, that what you were struggling with was something else." The rain was outside again. It always seemed to rain on the important nights. I could hear it against the kitchen window. "I wasn't sick," I said. "I mean, I'm getting older. There are things that come with that, but the dizziness, the furnace crisis, I exaggerated. I was testing everyone. I wanted to see who would show up." Diane was quiet. "That's a very lonely thing to feel like you have to do," she said finally. "Not, how could you not? That was manipulative. Not, we were so worried. Just, that's a very lonely thing to feel like you have to do." I stood at the sink with my hands in the cooling dishwater and I felt something break open in my chest, not painfully, but the way a window breaks open in spring, releasing something that had been sealed in for too long. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you. I understand why you did it," she said, and for what it's worth, she paused, choosing her words. "I think the results told you something true. Even if the method wasn't perfect, the people who didn't show up wouldn't have shown up even if everything had been real." I looked at her. "And you," I said. "You showed up." "I showed up," she agreed quietly, "because I wanted to." We finished the dishes. We didn't say much else. But there was something between us now that hadn't been there before. Something built from honesty and casserole soup and pie crust and rain-wet porches and the particular intimacy of people who have told each other difficult truths and survived it. I drove home that night with the heater on and the radio off and thought about all the ways I had been wrong about Diane, and all the ways I had been right about everyone else, and what any of it was supposed to mean now. December arrived the way December does in Ohio, slowly, grayly, with a cold that settles into the bones and doesn't leave until March. I spent the first week of December making a decision I had been circling for months. I called my attorney. Her name was Susan Hartley. She had been my attorney for over a decade. I had hired her originally to help with some paperwork after Richard and I bought a rental property years ago, and she had been handling my legal affairs since. She was 61, smart, direct, and had the unusual quality of actually telling you the truth about things even when the truth was not what you wanted to hear. I made an appointment. I went in on a Wednesday morning, sat across from her desk, and told her I wanted to review my estate documents. She pulled them up. The will Richard and I had made together, updated once after his death, left everything equally to Daniel and Kevin. The house, the investments, the retirement accounts, equal shares. The automatic, uncomplicated bequest of a woman who had assumed that equal love deserved equal treatment. "I want to make some changes," I said. Susan looked at me over her reading glasses. "What kind of changes?" I told her about Diane. Not the whole story, not the plan and the test and the notepad, but the essential truth underneath all of it. I told her about Richard dying and the boys stepping back. I told her about the Thanksgivings alone. I told her about the 11 days of silence that started all of this. And I told her about Diane showing up on a rainy Tuesday night, with soup ingredients and a blood pressure monitor, and sitting at my kitchen table for 3 hours and asking how I was actually feeling. Susan listened the way good attorneys listen, thoroughly, without judgment, filing everything. When I finished, she said, "You're wanting to adjust the distribution?" "Yes," I said. We talked through the specifics carefully. I wasn't interested in punishing my sons. I want to be clear about that. This was never about punishment. This was about truth, about letting the documents reflect the actual shape of my relationships, rather than the shape I had hoped they would take. What I decided was this. The house, when I eventually died, would go to Daniel and Kevin in equal shares. They had grown up in it, and I could not take that from them. But the liquid assets, the savings, the investments, the financial legacy of 40 years of Richard's careful work and my own, would be distributed differently. A substantial portion would go to Diane directly. Not to Daniel, not to a joint account, not filtered through the marriage to Diane. Because Diane was the person who had shown up, and the world I wanted to leave behind was one where showing up was rewarded. I also set up a trust for my granddaughter's education, Daniel's daughters, and, if Kevin ever had children, theirs too. I was not abandoning the next generation because their parents had disappointed me, and I made one more change, the one that mattered most to me personally. I updated my healthcare proxy and durable power of attorney. They had both listed Daniel as my primary agent. I changed them to Diane, not because I thought I was dying, not because I expected a crisis anytime soon, but because those documents are, in the most fundamental sense, an answer to the question, who do you trust to make decisions for you when you cannot make them yourself? And I knew the answer to that question now with a clarity I hadn't had before. Susan reviewed everything carefully. She asked me several times, in the careful way attorneys do, whether I was sure. Whether this was what I wanted. Whether I had considered the various implications. I told her I was sure. Walking out of her office into the December cold, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy. Exactly, the lightness had grief in it, the particular grief of accepting something you wished were different. But light, free of the weight of performing an expectation that no longer matched reality. I had one more thing to do. I called Daniel. Not Kevin first. Not Diane. Daniel. He was the eldest. He deserved to hear this from me, even if hearing it would be uncomfortable. He answered on the third ring. "Hey Mom, what's up? I need to talk to you about something," I said. "Can you give me some time?" An actual conversation, not a quick call. Something in my voice must have landed differently than usual, because he said, "Yeah, of course. Let me just." I heard him moving, the sound of a door closing. The background noise faded. "Okay. What's going on?" I told him. Not everything, not the full architecture of the plan, but the essential truth. I told him I had been struggling since Richard died. That I had been lonely in a way I hadn't known how to express. That the distance I had felt from him and Kevin over the past 4 years had been painful in ways I had absorbed quietly and alone. I told him that Diane had been showing up. That over the past several months, she had been the person in my life who called back, who came over, who stayed for dinner, who asked how I actually was. I did not tell him about the will, not yet. That conversation would come, eventually, in its own time, and I wanted it to have room to breathe. There was a long silence after I finished. "Mom," Daniel said. And then, again, "Mom." He sounded like a man trying to reorient himself in a room where the furniture has been moved. "I didn't realize," he said. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I genuinely didn't realize." "I know you didn't," I said. "You've been busy. You have your life. I understand all of that. But that doesn't." He stopped, started again. "I should have been calling more." "I know that, Renee has told me that. I think I convinced myself that you were fine because you always seem fine. You never ask for anything." "I know," I said. "I never learned to ask. That's my part in it." Another silence. "Diane's been coming over," he said. "Yes." He seemed to absorb that. "I didn't know," he said quietly. And there was something in his voice, not quite hurt, but something adjacent to it. A man realizing that his wife had been taking care of his mother in the space his absence had created. "She's a good person, Daniel," I said. "A genuinely good person. I don't think I saw that clearly enough. For a long time." "No," he said softly. "Me either." I don't know what passed between Daniel and Diane after that conversation. I know that things shifted slowly, the way things genuinely shift. Not in the dramatic movie moment way, but in the incremental, quiet way of real life. Daniel called more often. He came over twice in December, once with the girls, once alone. The first solo visit was slightly awkward. We were out of practice being in the same room without Richard or the boys' childhood as scaffolding, but we managed. We ordered pizza. We talked about the girls, and about a news story he was following, and about a memory he had of a camping trip we'd taken when he was 11. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway. A real hug, not the perfunctory pat that had become our default. He held on for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly, into the top of my head. "I know," I said. "I know you are." Kevin came by in mid-December, without Sandra, which was unusual. He sat in my kitchen and drank coffee and was quieter than normal. I thought about asking if something was wrong with the marriage. There had been signals for a while. Small tensions I had noticed and kept to myself, but I didn't. Some things are theirs to manage. And I had learned, perhaps late in life, the limits of what I could hold for other people. He said, before he left, "You know I love you, right, Mom?" "I know," I said. "I should be better at showing it." "You should," I agreed. Not harshly, but honestly. We all should be better at more things. The important thing is whether we start. He nodded. He hugged me too. And then he went back to his life, and I went back to mine. And what had happened between us was small and inconclusive, and entirely real, the only kind of change that actually lasts. Christmas arrived. I had not spent a Christmas in my own home with family since the year before Richard died. Every year since, I had been included as a guest somewhere, Renee's parents, once, which was kind but hollow. Kevin and Sandra's apartment. The year Sandra made the mistake of commenting on my green bean casserole being a little retro, which I had let pass with a smile. Because I am a civilized woman, or I had been alone, which was its own particular kind of Christmas. This year was different. Diane called me on December 15th and said, "We're doing Christmas at our house this year. I want it to be at our house, with a real tree, and I want you to come. Not as a guest, as family. Will you come?" I said yes. I will not dwell on the sentimental details of that Christmas. Because I am not a woman who does well with sentimentality as its own end. But I will tell you this. Diane had put a stocking for me on their mantel. A proper stocking, the kind you hang for someone you've always known. It had my name on it in cross-stitch. She told me later that she'd done it herself, late at night, over 2 evenings, because she'd decided it was important. I held that stocking for a moment, and did not trust myself to speak. My granddaughters, Lily, 16, and Abigail, 13, were more present than they'd been in years. Abigail had decided she wanted to learn to cook, and spent most of Christmas Eve in the kitchen with Diane and me. alternately helping and experimenting with alarming independence. Lily had questions about my early years, what I'd wanted to be when I was young, how I'd met Richard, what the world was like when I was her age. Real questions, the kind teenagers ask when they suddenly become curious about the people they've been taking for granted. I told Lily about the summer I was 17 and almost ran away to New York to become a singer. I had a terrible voice, but I didn't know it yet. Richard had told me, gently and with love, 2 years later, and that had been its own kind of painful and funny gift. Did you hate him for telling you? Lily asked. For about a week, I said. Then I realized it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. She thought about that. I think I'd want someone to tell me, she said. Even if it was hard. Most good things are hard, I told her. The trick is being able to tell the difference between hard and wrong. Daniel sat next to me at dinner and refilled my wine without being asked. Kevin, who'd come without Sandra, something I noted but didn't comment on, made a toast that was genuinely from the heart, about the people we love and the time we waste not saying so. He looked at me when he said it. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the girls were upstairs and Daniel had settled into the inevitable post-Christmas dinner inertia, Diane and I sat on the back porch with blankets and hot tea, even though it was cold enough that our breath made small clouds. Can I ask you something? I said. Always. The night you came over. The first time, in the rain, I wrapped my hands around my mug. You said Daniel had mentioned it and you couldn't let it go. But I don't think that's the full answer. I've thought about it many times since, and I don't think that's all of it. Diane was quiet for a moment. She looked at the dark backyard, the bare December trees. My mother died alone, she said. In the memory care facility, on a Tuesday night in March. I had been there that afternoon, and I had thought about staying. But I had a meeting the next morning and I told myself I'd come back the next day. She died at 2 a.m. and the facility called me at 2:20. The air was cold and still around us. I have to live with that, she said. I'll always have to live with that. I didn't know she was going, and there's nothing I can do about it now. But what I decided, after she died, was that I wasn't going to let something like that happen again. I wasn't going to ignore the signal that someone needed me because it was inconvenient, or because I didn't know them well enough, or because I assumed someone else would handle it. She turned to look at me. You needed someone, she said simply. And I knew how to show up. So I showed up. I looked at this woman I had spent 15 years not seeing, and felt the particular emotion that has no clean name, something between gratitude and grief, and love, and the ache of all the time lost. Thank you, I said, for showing up. Thank you for opening the door, she said. We sat there in the cold for a long time, not talking, just sitting, two women on a back porch in the Ohio winter, wrapped in blankets, breathing small clouds into the December air. In the spring, I told Diane about the will. I had debated waiting longer. I had debated not telling her at all. The documents would speak. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes after a long reckoning. It doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or flood you with sudden joy. It comes slowly, the way spring comes to New Jersey. In increments so small you almost miss them. A morning when you wake up and the first thing you feel isn't loneliness. A phone call you actually look forward to answering. A Sunday dinner that feels earned than performed. That's what the spring after that Christmas felt like for me. I turned 68 in April. It was a Thursday. In previous years, my birthday had been the occasion for a phone call from each boy, dutiful, brief, the kind of call that checks a box, and, if I was lucky, a dinner that one of them organized with the vague guilt of someone who knows they should do more, but has decided this is enough. This year, Diane organized it. She didn't make a fuss about it. That wasn't her way. She called me 3 weeks before and asked what I actually wanted to do. Not what would be easy, not what fit everyone's schedule, what I actually wanted. I thought about it seriously, the way you think about things when someone asks you a real question. I want dinner at my house, I said. My table. My cooking. I want to cook for people I love, and have them sit at my table and eat what I made. Then that's what we'll do, she said. I cooked for 2 days. Not because I had to, I could have managed it in 1 day easily enough, but because I wanted to. Because cooking at 68 in your own kitchen, preparing food for people who will actually show up to eat it, is one of the quiet dignities of a life that has found its footing again. I made Richard's mother's pot roast, which took the better part of a Saturday. I made the green bean casserole, deliberately, without apology, and it was excellent, as it had always been. I made 2 pies with pie crusts that Diane, when she arrived early to help set the table, looked at and said, "Show me how you do that. I mean it this time. Show me exactly." So I showed her. Daniel came with the girls. Kevin came alone, and I noted the alone without comment, though later, when he helped me carry dishes to the kitchen, and we were briefly private, he said simply, "Sandra and I are taking some time apart," and I said, "I'm sorry," and he said, "I think it might be for the better, eventually," and I said, "Then I'm sorry," and hopeful at the same time, and he laughed in a way that told me he needed that. Abigail asked if she could help cook next time. Lily sat next to me at dinner and showed me a short story she'd written for her English class, a story about an old woman who discovers something surprising about herself late in life, and the details in it, the particular textures of it, were close enough to things I had said to her at Christmas that I understood she had been listening in a way teenagers rarely let you see. "This is wonderful," I told her. "I based it kind of on you," she admitted, with the self-consciousness of a teenager revealing something real. "I'm honored," I said, and meant it completely. After dinner, when the dishes were washed and the leftovers were wrapped and the kitchen was clean, everyone sat in my living room in the pleasant exhaustion of a good meal and good company. Daniel had his arm around Diane in an unconscious, settled way. The girls were on the floor with their phones, but they kept entering the conversation, Abigail with a question about the pot roast recipe, Lily with a comment about something Kevin had said, the way young people do when they're actually comfortable somewhere. Kevin sat near me on the sofa. At one point, without preamble, he said, "Do you remember when I was about 9 and I broke the lamp in the living room trying to play indoor baseball?" "I remember," I said. "Dad covered for me," he said. "He told you he'd knocked it over by accident." I looked at him. "I knew it was you." Kevin stared at me. "You knew." "I always knew," I said. "I knew everything. I just chose what to address and what to let your father handle in his own way." Kevin laughed genuinely, from the belly. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because your father looked so pleased with himself for protecting you," I said. "And I loved watching him be your father." The room got quiet in a particular way. The way a room gets when someone says something that touches the center of something real. "I miss him," Kevin said. "I know," I said. "So do I every day." Daniel cleared his throat from across the room. He was looking at the framed photo on the bookshelf, Richard and me at our 30th anniversary dinner, laughing at something just off camera, the way people laugh when they know each other well enough to find the same things funny. "He'd have liked this," Daniel said. "Tonight, all of us here." Nobody argued with that. In the spring, I told Diane about the will. I had practiced what I was going to say. I had thought about it through the long Ohio winter, through the Christmas and the New Year, and the slow return of light in February. I had turned the words over in my mind many times. But when the moment came, we were in my kitchen, a Saturday afternoon in May, the windows open for the first time since October, the smell of something green and warming coming through. I found that I didn't need the practiced words. I just told her. I told her I had updated my estate documents. I told her about the financial distribution, about the liquid assets, about the portion I had directed to her specifically. I told her about the healthcare proxy and the power of attorney that her name was now on those documents where Daniel's had been. I told her why. I watched her face as I talked. She had a way, when something affected her, of going very still. Not cold still, the way a lake goes, still in the absence of wind. Like everything was going inward, being processed somewhere deep. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," she said, and then she stopped. "You don't have to say anything," I said. "I'm not telling you because I want your reaction. I'm telling you because you deserved to know. Because you've been making decisions for me, driving me to appointments, handling paperwork, showing up, and you deserved to know that those decisions are reflected in how I've arranged things." "Daniel," she started. "Daniel will be fine," I said. "The house is still equal. His daughter's education is provided for. What I've arranged is a reflection of reality, not a punishment." "He's going to have feelings about it," she said. "I know," I said. "That's okay, he's allowed to have feelings about it. But the arrangement stands." Diane looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, not crying, but close to it, which was the most emotion I had ever seen from her. "I didn't show up for the money," she said. Her voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible. "I know that," I said. "That's exactly why you're getting it." She looked away, out the window at the May afternoon. A bird was doing something complicated in the oak tree at the edge of my yard. "When my mother died," she said slowly, "I was the one who went through her things. My brother sent a list of what he wanted. My sister called once to ask about the jewelry. I packed her whole life into boxes, by myself, over 4 weekends. And then I donated most of it to a women's shelter because I thought she would have liked that." She paused. There was nothing in her will that reflected any of that. Everything was split equally. "My brother got the same as me." "I know," I said. "It doesn't matter about the money," she said. "But it mattered that it wasn't acknowledged. That showing up wasn't acknowledged. That doing the work of love wasn't acknowledged." She turned back to me. "So, thank you for acknowledging it." We sat with that for a moment. "I owe you an apology," I said then. "An overdue one." She looked at me. "For 15 years, I said, I read your reserve as indifference. I decided you didn't like me, and I stopped trying to know you. I built a story about you in my head and I let it stand without questioning it. And because of that story, I missed 15 years of knowing someone I think I actually would have liked knowing." Diane was quiet. "I wasn't easy to know," she said finally. "I was dealing with a lot of things I didn't talk about. My mother, my marriage." A pause. "I wasn't warm in the ways you were used to. I'm still not." "I know," I said. "I don't need warm. I've spent 68 years surrounded by people who were very warm and didn't show up. I've learned to value different qualities." She smiled at that. Diane's smiles were small and deliberate, not the reflexive, generous kind, but this one was real. "We wasted a lot of time," she said. "We did," I agreed, "but we have time now. I intend to use it." There is a question I am sometimes asked by Loretta from church, when I finally told her some of this story, and by Susan the attorney, and by my neighbor Phyllis, who had figured out something was going on, but had waited patiently for me to decide to explain it. The question is, do I regret the plan, the test, the performance? I sit with that question every time it comes. Here is what I believe. The plan was the wrong tool for the right problem. I should have had honest conversations with my sons years earlier. I should have said, when Richard died and the casserole stopped and the calls got shorter. I should have said, "I am struggling, and I need you to show up differently than you have been." I should have asked for what I needed, directly and clearly. Instead of absorbing the absence until it became something I needed to test. That's the truth. I own it. But I also believe this. The plan revealed something that honest conversations might not have. Because the thing about honest conversations is that people can perform them. They can say the right things, feel temporarily guilty, make temporary adjustments, and then drift back to their default settings. The test revealed what people did when they thought there were real stakes, and nobody was watching. That kind of information is harder to perform. My sons didn't show up. Not because they're bad men. They're not bad men. They are imperfect and distracted and products of a culture that told them their mothers would always be fine. And I let them believe it, but because the muscles of showing up had atrophied in them. And they didn't notice, and I had spent too long not pointing it out. Diane showed up. Because she had learned, at a cost she still carries, what it meant not to. The plan didn't create the truth. It just made the truth visible. And visible truth, however painful, is always better than the comfortable lie. I am 68 years old. I live in the same house in Dayton, Ohio, where I raised 2 boys and buried a husband and spent 41 years building a life. The furnace works perfectly. It always did. I had exaggerated that particular detail, though there is genuinely a light bulb in the hallway that I have been meaning to replace for 3 months, and simply haven't. My sons call more often. Daniel is better than he was, not transformed, not the son I might have wished for in some idealized version of my life, but better, in the real and incremental and entirely sufficient way that people become better when they understand. Something has been asked of them. Kevin is navigating the end of his marriage with more grace than I expected and more pain than he shows, and I call him twice a week, and sometimes we talk for an hour about nothing and everything. And I hope, that those calls are a small anchor for him, the way his father's presence was an anchor for me. Diane comes on Thursdays. Sometimes Abigail comes too, increasingly interested in learning to cook. Increasingly present in the specific way of a young person who has found an older person she considers worth knowing. Lily texts me occasionally, short messages, links to articles she thought of me when she read, questions about history or about what things were like before the internet. I answer every one. Last Thursday, Diane and I were sitting at my kitchen table after dinner. The evenings are longer now, we're in May, and the light lingers until almost 8. Which after the long Ohio winter feels like a gift so extravagant it's almost hard to accept. She was reading something on her phone. I was finishing a cup of tea. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and full of the small sounds of a house where someone lives. At some point, she looked up and said, "What are you thinking about?" And I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Richard, and the 40 years and the rainy night she had shown up on my porch, and the notepad with its careful columns, and the Christmas stocking with my name on it, and the pie crust and the soy sauce packets, and the long porch conversation in the December cold. And all the years I had spent being the kind of woman who absorbed things quietly, and the day I had decided that was over. I'm thinking, I said, that it took me 67 years to learn that asking for help isn't weakness, that needing people isn't a burden. That the right response to loneliness isn't to endure it more quietly, it's to find the people who are willing to sit with you in it. Diane looked at me steadily. What changed? She asked. You knocked on my door, I said. She smiled, that small, deliberate, real smile. You opened it, she said, and outside, through the kitchen window, the May light was golden long, and the oak tree was full of leaves. And somewhere in it a bird was singing with the particular brightness of a creature that has come through winter, and finds itself, unexpectedly, still here. I finished my tea. I was still here too. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly enough.